Finn the human begins his existence as an anomaly, a contradiction that should not be possible in the world he inhabits. He is the last of his kind, in a land populated by candy people and fire elementals, by sentient video game consoles and ancient vampires, by beings whose origins stretch back millions of years and whose powers defy comprehension. He is a human boy in a post-apocalyptic wasteland that has forgotten what humans were, surrounded by creatures who regard his species as either extinct curiosity or dim historical footnote, and yet he thrives. He becomes a hero. He saves the world repeatedly before his 16th birthday. The question that will haunt him for the rest of his life, the question that will eventually break him in ways that no monster or villain ever could, is simple. What happens to the hero when the heroism runs out? The psychology of Finn cannot be understood without first understanding the psychology of abandonment, because abandonment is the foundation upon which his entire personality was constructed. He was found as an infant on a leaf in the forest, crying and alone, discovered by the shape-shifting magical dogs Joshua and Margaret, who chose to raise him as their own alongside their biological son Jake. This origin story, which the show presents with characteristic lightness in early seasons, contains the seed of everything that will follow. Finn did not choose to be abandoned. He did not choose to be the last human. He did not choose to be raised by creatures fundamentally different from himself. These circumstances were imposed upon him before he had language to understand them or agency to resist them, and they shaped the architecture of his mind in ways he would spend decades failing to recognize. The psychological literature on adopted children reveals patterns that map uncomfortably well onto Finn's behavior throughout the series. Adopted children often develop what researchers call a rejection sensitivity, a hyper-awareness of potential abandonment that manifests as either desperate people, pleasing, or preemptive withdrawal. Finn embodies the former pattern with striking consistency. He is relentlessly helpful, compulsively heroic, constitutionally incapable of refusing a call to adventure or a person in need. This is not simply because he is good, though he is good. It is because helping others provides the only reliable source of validation available to someone whose earliest experience taught him that existence itself is precarious, that being left behind is always possible, that love must be earned through usefulness rather than assumed through belonging. The show's early seasons present Finn's heroism as uncomplicated virtue, and for a children's cartoon, this presentation was appropriate and even necessary. Children need heroes who are simply good, who do the right thing because it is right, who model ethical behavior without drowning in psychological complexity. But as the show matured alongside its audience, it began interrogating the foundations of Finn's goodness, began asking whether compulsive heroism might be a symptom rather than a trait, began suggesting that the boy who saves everyone might be trying to save himself from something he cannot name. The relationship with Jake provides the first lens through which we can examine Finn's psychological development, because Jake represents both the solution to and the perpetuation of Finn's core wound. Jake is family, chosen family, the brother who stayed when biological family abandoned him. Jake's presence proves that Finn is lovable, that he belongs somewhere, that the rejection of his infancy was not a verdict on his worth, but an accident of circumstance. This is healing, genuine, and important. But Jake is also fundamentally different from Finn, in ways that create distance even within intimacy. Jake has biological children. Jake has a girlfriend who becomes a wife. Jake has connections to the magical dog community, to his parents' legacy, to lineages and histories that Finn cannot access. Jake belongs to the world in a way that Finn, as the last human, simply cannot. The show depicts this difference with subtle precision across its 10 seasons. Jake can stretch and transform, can become anything, can adapt to any situation through literal, physical flexibility. Finn is stuck in his body, limited to human capabilities, reliant on weapons and armor and learned skills rather than innate magical ability. Jake approaches problems with laid-back confidence, secure in his identity and his place in the world. Finn approaches problems with desperate intensity, as though each challenge is an opportunity to prove something, as though failure would confirm fears too terrible to consciously acknowledge. They love each other completely. They are brothers in every meaningful sense. And yet Finn is alone in a way that Jake can never fully understand, because Jake has never experienced the fundamental alienation of being the only one of your kind. This alienation intensifies as Finn enters adolescence and begins seeking romantic connection. His early crush on Princess Bubblegum, which the show initially plays for comedy, reveals the depth of his need for belonging when examined psychologically. Bubblegum is centuries old, brilliant beyond human comprehension, responsible for an entire kingdom of beings she literally created. She is as far from Finn's peer as any being in Oo could be. And yet he pursues her with single-minded devotion, interpreting every scrap of attention as encouragement, unable to accept rejection, even when it is clearly and kindly delivered. This is not healthy romantic interest. This is the abandoned child seeking proof of worth from the most impressive figure available, hoping that her love would validate his existence in ways that simply being alive has never quite managed. The show handles this dynamic with remarkable sophistication for a children's program, allowing Finn's feelings to be real and sympathetic while never endorsing his inability to accept boundaries. Bubblegum cares for Finn. She values him as a friend and ally. She does not owe him romance simply because he wants it, and the show makes clear that his persistent pursuit, however understandable given his psychology, is not behavior to be emulated. This is subtle but crucial education for young viewers, modeling the difference between having feelings and being entitled to reciprocation, between caring for someone and demanding that they care back. Finn's arc through the early seasons establishes patterns that will define his psychology for the remainder of the series. He throws himself into danger without adequate consideration. He struggles to process negative emotions, preferring action to reflection. He defines himself almost entirely through his relationships and his heroic role, leaving little space for an identity that could survive if those external supports were removed. He is, in psychological terms, externally regulated, dependent on environmental feedback to maintain equilibrium rather than possessing internal resources for self-soothing and self-validation. This is common in children who experienced early abandonment, whose nervous systems never learned to trust that safety was stable, whose survival depended on constant vigilance and performance rather than secure attachment. The tragedy that makes Finn compelling as a character is that his coping mechanisms work, at least for a while. His compulsive heroism does make him valuable to his community. His desperate need for connection does attract people who genuinely love him. His inability to quit does save lives and defeat villains. The problem with maladaptive coping mechanisms is not that they fail entirely, but that they succeed partially, providing enough reinforcement to prevent the development of healthier alternatives, while slowly accumulating costs that will eventually come due. Finn does not know he is broken because his brokenness has been so effective at achieving the goals his conscious mind has set. He will not discover the extent of the damage until circumstances conspire to strip away the external supports his psyche has learned to require. The episode that changes everything, that marks the boundary between Finn's childhood and something darker, is titled Escape from the Citadel, and it delivers consequences that the show will spend seasons processing. Finn meets his biological father for the first time and discovers that the man is a selfish, cowardly criminal who abandoned his infant son without remorse and feels no connection to the young hero standing before him. In the chaos that follows, Finn loses his arm, torn from his body, in a moment of desperate reaching toward a father who is already fleeing, who chooses escape over connection, who confirms every fear the abandoned child has carried since before he could speak. The symbolism is almost too perfect to require analysis. Finn reaches for his father and loses part of himself in the reaching. The limb that extends toward connection is the limb that is sacrificed. The message inscribed on his body is that wanting love from those who cannot give it will cost you pieces of yourself that cannot be recovered. This is not subtext. This is text, delivered with surgical precision to a character whose entire psychology has been organized around the desperate pursuit of belonging. The physical loss of the arm is significant, but the psychological loss is catastrophic in ways the show depicts with uncomfortable accuracy. Finn does not process this trauma. He cannot process this trauma. He lacks the internal resources, the emotional vocabulary, the secure foundation from which processing becomes possible. Instead, he does what he has always done when confronted with pain too large to contain. He acts. He buries the grief beneath activity. He transforms the wound into motivation for more heroism, more adventure, more external validation to fill the void that has suddenly grown larger than his ability to ignore. The show tracks the aftermath of this trauma across multiple seasons, showing how unprocessed pain leaks into every aspect of Finn's life. His relationships suffer, his judgment deteriorates. He makes choices that harm people he loves, driven by needs he cannot articulate and fears he cannot face. The arm regenerates eventually, through magical means that the show wisely refuses to invest with too much significance. But the psychological wound remains open, infected by the refusal to clean it, spreading poison through systems that were already strained. The father wound, as psychologists sometimes call it, is particularly devastating for boys and men in cultures that discourage emotional vulnerability. Finn has been raised in a world where heroes fight and win, where problems are solved through action, where feelings are obstacles to be overcome rather than information to be integrated. He has no model for how to grieve the father he never had, no permission to mourn the relationship that was denied him, no language for the specific pain of being rejected by someone who should have loved you unconditionally. So he does not grieve, he does not mourn. He converts the pain to anger when he can, and buries it beneath compulsive activity when he cannot, building pressure in a system that was never designed to contain this much unexpressed emotion. The subsequent seasons show Finn cycling through relationships with increasing desperation and decreasing wisdom. He pursues Flame Princess with intensity that mirrors his earlier pursuit of Bubblegum, seeking in romantic love the validation that parental love failed to provide. When that relationship ends, partly through his own poor choices, he spirals further. He makes decisions that are out of character, that violate his established ethics, that suggest a person losing coherence under pressure they cannot acknowledge. The show frames these choices as mistakes Finn must learn from, and they are. But they are also symptoms of a deeper crisis that mere learning cannot resolve. The genius of Adventure Time's approach to Finn's psychology is its refusal to provide easy healing. Lesser shows would have given Finn a breakthrough episode, a conversation or confrontation that resolves his father issues and allows him to move forward whole. Adventure Time understands that trauma does not work that way, that the wounds inflicted in childhood do not close simply because we understand their origins. That insight without integration is just another form of knowing that changes nothing. Finn gains insight across these seasons. He comes to understand intellectually that his father's abandonment was not his fault, that his worth does not depend on being wanted by someone incapable of wanting. But this intellectual understanding does not reach the parts of him that were damaged before he had intellect, does not soothe the nervous system that learned danger before it learned language, does not fill the void that has been empty since before he could remember it being full. The arm becomes a recurring symbol throughout the series, present in alternate timelines and possible futures, always marking Finn as someone who has been broken by reaching. In Farmworld, the timeline where the Mushroom War was prevented, Finn loses the same arm to different circumstances. In the vision of his death, shown in Together Again, he is an old man with a mechanical prosthetic, still carrying the evidence of ancient wound. The show suggests that some losses are not contingent, that some wounds are woven into the fabric of who a person is, that Finn will always be someone who reached for something he could not have and lost part of himself in the attempt. This is not fatalism, but realism, the acknowledgement that our histories shape us in ways we cannot simply decide to transcend. The psychological concept most relevant to Finn's post-Citadel development is repetition compulsion, the tendency of traumatized individuals to unconsciously recreate the conditions of their trauma in an attempt to master what originally overwhelmed them. Finn's romantic relationships follow this pattern with disturbing consistency. He chooses partners who cannot or will not give him what he needs, then pursues them with the same desperate intensity he showed toward his fleeing father, then experiences rejection that confirms his deepest fears about his own lovability. He is not consciously choosing to be hurt. He is unconsciously seeking opportunities to rewrite a story that has already been written, hoping that this time the reaching will be rewarded, that this time the parent figure will stay, that this time he will be enough. The repetition compulsion is one of psychology's most counterintuitive concepts, the idea that we are drawn to recreate our worst experiences, not despite the pain they caused, but because of it. The unconscious mind seeks closure, seeks mastery, seeks to finally get right what originally went wrong. But the recreation almost always fails because we bring to it the same unprocessed material that made the original experience so damaging. Finn approaches new relationships with the same desperate neediness, the same inability to tolerate rejection, the same fundamental belief that he must earn love through heroic performance. He recreates the conditions of abandonment because those are the conditions he knows, because his nervous system was calibrated in infancy to expect rejection, because safety feels more dangerous to him than danger. This dynamic explains much of Finn's romantic behaviour that might otherwise seem out of character or poorly written. Why does he pursue unavailable women? Because availability would require him to confront his own capacity for intimacy without the protective buffer of impossibility. Why does he sabotage relationships that begin to work? Because success would prove that love is possible. and some part of him cannot tolerate that proof because it would invalidate the defensive structure he has built around the original wound. Why does he seem to learn nothing from repeated failures? Because the failures are not failures from the perspective of his unconscious, which is not trying to achieve love, but trying to master abandonment, not trying to succeed, but trying to finally make sense of original failure. The show's decision to have Finn's arm regenerate through magical means, only to have him lose it again in alternate timelines and possible futures, speaks to the permanence of psychological wounds even when their physical manifestations heal. You can get your arm back, but you cannot unlearn what it felt like to lose it. You can enter new relationships, but you cannot unknow what it felt like to reach for love and grasp only empty air. The body heals faster than the psyche, and Finn's story is ultimately about the slow, difficult work of psychological healing that cannot be accomplished through magic or adventure or even the genuine love of friends and family. It can only be accomplished through the patient, often boring work of confronting what has been buried, and Finn is not yet ready for that work as the middle seasons begin. The middle seasons of Adventure Time document Finn's psychological deterioration with a precision that borders on clinical observation. He is no longer the uncomplicated hero of early episodes, no longer the boy whose goodness was simple and whose motivations were transparent. He has become something more troubling and more human. A young man carrying wounds he cannot acknowledge, making choices he cannot explain, losing pieces of himself to a void he cannot name. The show charts this deterioration not through dramatic breakdown, but through accumulating evidence, small moments that add up to a portrait of someone slowly losing coherence. The relationship with Flame Princess exemplifies the pattern that will define Finn's romantic life going forward. Here is a girl who is literally dangerous, whose touch burns, whose very nature makes intimacy potentially lethal. A psychologically healthy person might recognize this incompatibility and seek connection elsewhere. Finn pursues her with abandon, drawn precisely to the danger, finding in the impossibility of safe contact something that resonates with his internal experience of love as inherently threatening. When he finally achieves a relationship with her, he cannot maintain it. He manipulates her into fighting Ice King, betraying her trust for reasons he cannot articulate, sabotaging the very connection he worked so hard to build. The episode Frost and Fire depicts this sabotage with uncomfortable clarity. Finn has dreams about Flame Princess and Ice King fighting, dreams that are clearly sexual in their energy, though the show maintains appropriate ambiguity for its audience. Rather than examining what these dreams might mean, rather than integrating this emerging sexuality into his conscious self-understanding, Finn acts out. He arranges for the dreams to become reality, manipulating the people he claims to love into conflict for his own unconscious satisfaction. When Flame Princess discovers the manipulation, she ends the relationship, and Finn is left with consequences he earned but cannot understand. This pattern of unconscious sabotage repeats throughout the middle seasons. Finn makes choices that harm his relationships, then experiences genuine confusion about why he made those choices, then suffers consequences that reinforce his belief that he is somehow unworthy of love. The cycle is self-perpetuating because Finn lacks the psychological tools to interrupt it. He cannot examine his unconscious motivations because he does not believe he has unconscious motivations. He is a hero, and heroes act from clear moral purpose, not from murky psychological need. The gap between his self-concept and his actual behavior widens with each passing season, creating a cognitive dissonance that expresses itself as depression, as purposelessness, as the slow erosion of the identity he once wore so comfortably. The show introduces the character of Fern as an externalization of this internal conflict, a grass clone of Finn who embodies everything the original cannot accept about himself. Fern is Finn's aggression without his inhibition, Finn's desire without his morality, Finn's shadow in the Jungian sense, made literal and given form. The relationship between Finn and Fern tracks the psychological process of confronting denied aspects of the self, complete with initial rejection, gradual recognition, and the eventual necessity of integration. Fern wants to be Finn, to replace him, to claim the life and relationships that Finn has earned. Finn must learn to accept that Fern is part of him, that the violence and selfishness Fern represents are not foreign intrusions, but aspects of his own nature that he has refused to acknowledge. The psychological concept of the shadow describes those parts of ourselves that we reject, deny, and project onto others. Finn's shadow is substantial because his self-concept is so rigidly heroic. He cannot be selfish because he is the hero. He cannot be violent beyond necessity because he is the good guy. He cannot want things for purely personal reasons because his purpose is to serve others. These denials create pressure, force the rejected aspects into the unconscious, where they grow stronger through being unfed, until eventually they emerge in forms too powerful to ignore. Fern is Finn's shadow given flesh, and the conflict between them is the conflict every person must eventually face with the parts of themselves they have tried to disown. The resolution of the Fern storyline in the series finale represents a kind of psychological integration, though the show wisely refuses to present it as complete healing. Fern dies, but his consciousness persists in the form of a new being, a tree growing from the site of their final confrontation. Finn must live with the knowledge that part of himself has been externalized, that the shadow he fought and rejected and ultimately embraced is now separate from him in a new way. This is not the triumphant integration of Jungian therapy, but something more ambiguous, more true to how psychological growth actually occurs. We do not absorb our shadows cleanly. We learn to coexist with them, to acknowledge their existence without being controlled by them, to hold the tension between who we want to be and who we also are. The middle seasons also track Finn's growing disconnection from the heroic identity that once defined him. Early Finn wanted nothing more than to be a hero, to fight monsters, to save princesses, to embody the adventure that his world seemed to promise. Middle seasons, Finn still performs these actions, but with diminishing enthusiasm, with growing awareness that the heroic script he has been following might not contain the meaning he assumed it did. He has saved the world multiple times. He has defeated cosmic threats, and yet he feels empty, purposeless, uncertain what any of it was for. The external validation that once sustained him has become insufficient, but he has no internal resources to replace it. This is the crisis of meaning that awaits anyone whose identity is entirely externally constructed. You can be the best hero in the world, can accumulate achievements and accolades beyond counting, and still wake up one morning wondering what the point of any of it was. Finn reaches this point gradually, without dramatic announcement, simply finding that the activities which once filled him now leave him hollow. The show does not resolve this crisis within its original run. It cannot be resolved through plot, through defeating a villain, or achieving a goal. It can only be resolved through the slow, patient work of building internal resources, of learning to generate meaning rather than finding it, of becoming someone whose existence is justified by existing rather than by achieving. The The relationship between Finn and Jake changes during these seasons in ways that reflect Finn's psychological development and its costs. Jake has his own life now, his own family, his own priorities that do not always centre Finn. This is healthy and appropriate, the natural differentiation that should occur as siblings become adults. But for Finn, whose attachment to Jake has been one of his primary sources of stability, this differentiation feels like another abandonment. He does not articulate this feeling, probably does not consciously recognize it, but his behavior reflects it. He becomes more reckless, more prone to danger, as though testing whether Jake will still save him, whether the brother, who has always been there, will continue to be there now that other claims compete for his attention. Jake does remain there, always, because Jake's love for Finn is genuine and deep. But Jake cannot give Finn what Finn actually needs, which is not rescue, but the development of self-rescue, not continued dependence, but the capacity for independence, not more external support, but the construction of internal support that can survive when external support is unavailable. This is the work Finn must eventually do, the work that no one can do for him, the work that the series finale will suggest he has begun, but certainly has not completed. Psychological development is not a problem to be solved, but a process to be engaged, and Finn's process is only beginning as the original series draws to its close. The Islands miniseries represents Adventure Time's most sustained attempt to address Finn's psychological wounds through direct confrontation with their source. For the first time since his infancy, Finn travels to find other humans, to discover where he came from, to answer questions that have haunted him since before he knew how to ask them. The journey is explicitly therapeutic in its structure, forcing Finn to encounter aspects of his history that he has successfully avoided by remaining in Oo, by filling his days with adventure, by never pausing long enough to wonder what might happen if he stopped. The discovery of the human islands and Finn's biological mother, Minerva, should be triumphant, the resolution of an orphan's deepest longing. Instead, the show presents it as profoundly complicated, as bittersweet in ways that refuse easy emotional categorization. Minerva is alive, but she is no longer human in the conventional sense. She has uploaded her consciousness into a vast network of robotic helpers, distributed her being across an entire infrastructure dedicated to protecting the human survivors. She loves Finn, genuinely and completely, but she loves him from inside machines, through screens and speakers, from a form that cannot hold him or be held by him. The psychological implications of this reunion deserve careful examination. Finn has spent his entire life seeking the mother who abandoned him, building an unconscious fantasy of what that reunion might mean, how it might heal the wound that has shaped his personality from infancy. Now he has found her, and she is both exactly what he needed and fundamentally unable to provide it. She is present, but not embodied. She is loving, but not available for the physical connection that infant attachment requires. She is the mother he wanted, and simultaneously the proof that the mother he wanted does not exist in the form he needed her to take. This is the cruelty of psychological healing, the way that getting what you thought you wanted often reveals that what you wanted was never the thing that would actually help. Finn wanted his mother. He has his mother now, but the wound was never really about her absence. It was about what that absence taught his nervous system, about the reliability of love, about the safety of attachment, about the fundamental trustworthiness of the world. Her presence cannot undo those lessons, because those lessons were learned before he had the cognitive capacity to revise them through new experience. He is happy to have found her. He is genuinely moved by her love for him, and he leaves the island still carrying the wound he arrived with, because that wound is not about her at all. It is about him, about what he became in response to circumstances that her return cannot change. The Islands miniseries also reveals the trauma at the root of human civilization on the islands, the reason Minerva became what she became, the fear that drove an entire society to extreme measures. A plague nearly destroyed them. Minerva lost her human body trying to save others. The survivors built walls and security systems and protocols designed to ensure that they would never be vulnerable again. They chose safety over freedom, protection over possibility, the elimination of risk over the acceptance of life's inherent uncertainty. And in making these choices, they created a society that Finn recognizes immediately as incompatible with who he is. Finn chooses to return to U rather than staying with his people, because he has learned that the safety the islands offer is not safety but stagnation, not protection but prison. This choice is psychologically significant in ways the show does not belabor but invites us to recognize. Finn is choosing adventure over security, possibility over certainty, the known dangers of his current life over the unknown comforts of a life that would require him to become someone else. He is choosing Jake over Minerva, in a sense, choosing the family he built over the family he was born to, validating through action the attachments he formed after abandonment, rather than seeking to replace them with the attachment that was denied him. This choice represents growth, even if it does not represent healing. Finn is no longer operating entirely from the wound of abandonment, no longer defining himself primarily through what he lacks. He has found his mother and chosen to leave her, has discovered his people and decided he is not one of them, has answered questions that have defined him since childhood and discovered that the answers do not change who he has become. This is maturity of a painful kind, the recognition that the past cannot be fixed through the present, that some losses are permanent regardless of what we discover or achieve, that becoming whole requires accepting the pieces that are missing rather than endlessly searching for them. The return to U is not the triumphant homecoming the narrative structure might suggest. Finn comes back knowing things he did not know before, carrying revelations that he has not yet integrated. He knows his mother loves him, but cannot be the mother he needed. He knows his people survive, but have chosen a path he cannot follow. He knows his origins, but finds that knowing does not dissolve the confusion those origins created. The knowledge is valuable, but insufficient, the beginning of work rather than its completion. Finn must now figure out what to do with information that has destabilized his previous understanding without yet providing a new framework to replace it. The Islands miniseries functions as a turning point in Finn's psychological journey, but it is a turning point of a particular kind. It does not resolve his abandonment wound so much as it transforms his relationship to that wound. Before the Islands, Finn could maintain the fantasy that finding his people would fix something fundamental about himself, that the hole in his psyche had a shape exactly matching the missing family and could be filled by their discovery. After the Islands, that fantasy is no longer available. He has found them. The hole remains. He must now confront the possibility that the whole was never about them at all, that it was always about what their absence created in him, that no external discovery can repair internal damage. This confrontation with the limits of external solutions represents a crucial developmental milestone, even though it does not feel like progress in the moment. Finn's illusions about healing through finding have been stripped away. He can no longer avoid his internal work by projecting its completion onto some future discovery. The mother has been found. The people have been located. The questions have been answered. And he is still broken in exactly the ways he was broken before, still carrying the wound that predates his capacity to remember being wounded. This is devastating, but also potentially liberating. The demolition of false hope that creates space for real work to begin. The psychological literature on reunion between adopted children and biological parents consistently shows outcomes more complex than popular narratives suggest. Some adoptees find healing in reconnection. Others find that the reunion opens wounds rather than closing them, forces confrontation with losses that had been successfully buried, disrupts coping mechanisms that were functioning well enough. Finn's experience aligns with this complexity, showing neither magical healing nor simple re-traumatization, but something harder to categorize, a mixture of genuine comfort and genuine disappointment, of answered questions and newly raised ones, of connection achieved and connection recognized as insufficient. The decision to leave the islands and return to U is ultimately a choice about identity as much as geography. Finn could have stayed. His mother wanted him to stay. An entire civilization of humans would have welcomed him. But staying would have meant becoming someone else, would have required abandoning the self he built in U, would have asked him to trade the identity forged through adventure for one determined by biological heritage. He is not willing to make this trade, and the unwillingness itself represents psychological health of a kind. He knows who he is. He values who he has become. He will not sacrifice that self simply because another option presents itself, even an option that promises the belonging he has sought his entire life. This capacity to choose the self you have built over the self you might have been is a mark of genuine maturation, evidence that Finn has developed an internal sense of identity that does not depend entirely on external circumstances. The abandoned child who began this story had no such internal anchor, defined himself entirely through relationships and heroic roles, could not have imagined choosing adventure over the family that was taken from him. Adult Finn can make this choice because he has become someone, has accumulated experiences and relationships and self-knowledge that constitute a self worth preserving. The islands represent what he might have been. U represents what he is. He chooses what he is. The relationship between Finn and Huntress Wizard emerges in the later seasons as something different from his previous romantic attachments, something that suggests the possibility of genuine intimacy for a character who has historically sabotaged every approach to it. Huntress Wizard is not a princess to be pursued or a dangerous flame to be managed. She is a peer, a fellow warrior, someone whose damage mirrors Finn's own in ways that create unexpected understanding rather than the usual collision. Their connection begins not with pursuit, but with parallel existence, two solitary figures who recognize something in each other without needing to name it. Huntress Wizard has built her entire life around avoiding attachment, around maintaining the solitude that keeps her safe from the vulnerability of connection. She and Finn should not work. Two people running from intimacy typically collide and bounce apart, each confirming the other's belief that closeness is dangerous. But something different happens here, something the show depicts with delicacy and restraint. The psychological term for what develops between them might be earned secure attachment, the gradual building of trust between two people whose early experiences taught them that trust was dangerous. This kind of attachment does not look like the passionate pursuit of Finn's earlier relationships. It looks like two people slowly allowing themselves to be seen, testing the waters of vulnerability in small increments, building a foundation of safety through accumulated evidence rather than hopeful assumption. Huntress Wizard understands Finn in ways that his previous love interests could not, because she shares his fundamental wound. She knows what it is to be alone in a way that others cannot comprehend. She knows what it is to build an identity around self-reliance, because dependence felt too dangerous. She knows what it is to want connection while fearing it, to approach intimacy with one hand while pushing it away with the other. This shared knowledge creates a kind of permission, a mutual recognition that they are both damaged and that their damage does not disqualify them from love, but rather informs the particular kind of love they might be able to build. The show's handling of this relationship is notable for what it refuses to do. It does not present Huntress Wizard as Finn's salvation, the person who will finally heal him through the power of love. It does not suggest that their connection resolves his underlying issues, or provides the secure attachment he missed in infancy. It does not follow the romantic comedy formula where the right person makes everything better. Instead, it shows two people with compatible damage attempting something difficult, with no guarantee of success, with full awareness that their histories make intimacy harder for them than for people who did not learn to fear it. The flute spell episode crystallizes this dynamic through a moment of genuine connection that is immediately followed by retreat. Finn and Huntress Wizard acknowledge their feelings for each other, share a kiss that represents real vulnerability for both of them, and then step back from what they have started. Huntress Wizard articulates the logic explicitly. They are both too focused on their respective paths, too committed to their solitary identities, too afraid of what deeper connection might cost them. The kiss happened, the feelings are real, and they choose to walk away anyway because neither is ready for what staying would require. This is psychologically sophisticated storytelling that refuses to conflate recognition with resolution. Finn and Huntress Wizard have recognized something in each other. They have admitted feelings that their defenses would typically prevent them from acknowledging. They have taken a step toward intimacy that represents genuine growth for both of them. And they have also recognized that one step is not the same as the journey, that feeling something does not obligate you to pursue it, that sometimes the healthiest choice is to acknowledge what could be while accepting that you are not yet capable of making it real. The relationship continues in this ambiguous space throughout the remainder of the series and into the spin-offs, never quite becoming what it could be, never entirely letting go of what it might become. This ambiguity is not failure of storytelling, but fidelity to psychological truth. Some relationships exist in potential for years before either party is ready to actualize them. Some connections must wait until the people involved have done the individual work that intimacy requires. Finn and Huntress Wizard are not ready for each other during the original series. Whether they might become ready, whether their individual growth might eventually align enough to make partnership possible, is a question the show leaves open, because life leaves such questions open. The Fiona and Cake spin-off revisits this relationship with adult Finn, showing a version of them who are apparently together, who have built something that the younger Finn could not have sustained. But even this relationship exists in crisis, with Finn poisoned and dying, with Huntress Wizard crossing dimensions to save him, with the ultimate fate of their connection tied to whether she can succeed in her desperate quest. The show suggests that even when damaged people find each other, the damage does not disappear. It becomes shared, becomes the context within which love must operate, becomes the particular challenge that this specific relationship must navigate rather than the obstacle that prevents relationship from forming. What Huntress Wizard represents for Finn psychologically is the possibility of intimacy between equals rather than the pursuit of idealized figures who can never reciprocate fully. His earlier relationships were marked by power imbalances, by his pursuit of women who were older, more powerful, more established than he was. Princess Bubblegum ruled a kingdom and possessed scientific knowledge centuries beyond his comprehension. Flame Princess was literally dangerous to touch, her very nature creating a barrier that made full intimacy impossible. These choices were not accidental. Finn was drawn to unavailable partners because availability would have forced him to confront his capacity for genuine connection, and he was not ready for that confrontation. Huntress Wizard changes the pattern because she is available in a new way, present as an equal rather than elevated as an ideal. She has her own damage, her own walls, her own reasons for avoiding connection. But she does not occupy the pedestal that Bubblegum occupied, does not present the literal danger that Flame Princess presented. She is a person, complicated and wounded and capable of meeting Finn where he actually is, rather than where his fantasies place her. This makes the relationship more frightening in some ways, because there is no external obstacle to blame if it fails. If Finn and Huntress Wizard cannot make it work, the failure will be theirs alone, a product of their internal limitations rather than incompatible circumstances. The fear of this kind of failure, of being truly seen and found wanting, is one of the deepest fears that abandonment creates. Finn's pursuit of unavailable women served a protective function. If they could not love him because of their circumstances, he never had to discover whether they could love him if those circumstances were removed. Huntress Wizard removes this protection. She is available, she is interested, she is capable of the intimacy Finn claims to want. And this forces him to confront the possibility that he might not actually be capable of receiving what she offers, that his wounds have made him unable to accept the very thing he has been seeking. The gradual development of Finn and Huntress Wizard's relationship, across the later seasons and into the spin-offs models, what psychological healing in relationship actually looks like. It is not dramatic breakthrough or sudden transformation. It is the slow accumulation of small moments of trust, each one building on the last, each one slightly expanding the capacity for vulnerability. They learn each other incrementally, testing boundaries, retreating when overwhelmed, returning when ready to try again. This is the rhythm of earned, secure attachment, the patient work of two wounded people, building something neither could build alone. The fact that their relationship is still unfolding in Fiona and Cake, still facing challenges, still requiring active work and sacrifice, reinforces the show's consistent message about psychological healing. There is no point at which the work is complete, no achievement that permanently resolves the underlying wounds, no partner who makes the internal struggle unnecessary. Huntress Wizard does not fix Finn. She loves him, which is different and in some ways harder. Loving a wounded person means accepting that the wounds will continue to affect the relationship, that healing is ongoing rather than achieved, that you are signing up for a process rather than an outcome. The series finale, Come Along With Me, attempts the impossible task of providing closure for a story that is fundamentally about the impossibility of closure. Finn has grown across 10 seasons, but has not healed. He has learned, but has not transformed. He has become an adult in years without fully becoming one in psychological development. The finale must honour this incomplete growth while still providing the emotional satisfaction that endings require, must acknowledge that the story continues beyond its frame while still giving the audience permission to leave. The final confrontation with Golb, the embodiment of chaos and destruction, brings together characters from across the series in a battle that is epic in scope but psychological in its true significance. Finn fights alongside his friends against a threat that cannot be defeated through conventional means, that represents something too fundamental to be simply destroyed. The resolution comes not through violence, but through music, through the power of Betty's sacrifice, through the transformation of threat into something less threatening rather than its elimination. Betty's choice to merge with Golb rather than destroy it carries psychological implications for Finn that the show does not explicitly address, but invites us to consider. She is another parent figure who abandons him, in a sense, another adult whose choices prioritize something other than remaining present for those who love her. But her abandonment is also salvation. Her leaving is also protection. Her choice to go is what allows the others to stay. The psychology of sacrifice is complex, and Finn must integrate yet another loss that is simultaneously a gift, another departure that is also an act of love. The finale's epilogue shows glimpses of the future, of what becomes of these characters across centuries and millennia. We see Finn and Jake as old men, then as departed souls, then as reincarnated beings in a cycle that suggests their bond transcends any individual lifetime. These images are beautiful but also melancholic, reminders that even the closest relationships are temporary from a sufficient perspective, that love does not prevent loss but rather makes loss meaningful, that the adventure ends for everyone eventually, regardless of how heroic their journey might have been. The psychological significance of these final images for Finn's arc is worth dwelling on. He is shown to have lived a full life, to have aged, and presumably to have grown in ways the series did not have time to depict. The old Finn we glimpse is not the desperate, wounded young man of the middle seasons, but someone who has apparently found some kind of peace. The show does not explain how this transformation occurred, because transformation of that kind cannot be explained in a montage or a single episode. It occurs across decades of mundane experience, of daily choices, of slow accumulation of new patterns over old wounds. The show can only gesture toward this growth while trusting us to understand that the work happened off-screen in the space between the ending and the distant future it depicts. The death of Finn, shown explicitly in the Together Again special, returns us to the psychological themes that have defined his character from the beginning. Even in death, Finn is searching. He is looking for Jake, who died before him, whose absence created a hole that Finn's continued life could not fill. The special shows Finn journeying through the afterlife, confronting his fear of being alone, ultimately reuniting with the brother whose presence made his existence bearable. The message is clear. Finn's fundamental wound was always about connection, about the terror of isolation, about the desperate need to not be the last one, the left one, the abandoned one. The reunion with Jake in death is both triumphant and tragic, a reminder that the connection Finn sought all his life was always available to him, while simultaneously acknowledging that it could not fully heal him. Jake was there. Jake loved him. Jake never abandoned him in the way his parents did. And yet Finn still carried the wound, still struggled with intimacy, still built walls that his best friend's love could not entirely breach. This is the truth about psychological damage that the show has consistently honoured. Love helps, connection matters, relationships are essential, but none of these things automatically heal what was broken before we were capable of understanding it was broken. The healing is separate work, internal work, work that love supports but cannot replace. The final image of Finn and Jake, together, in whatever comes after death, is as close to peace as this character has ever found. They are together. They are no longer separated by the differential mortality that haunted their relationship in life. Jake's early death, which the show only implies, but which the spin-offs confirm was traumatic for Finn in ways he never fully processed, has been resolved through Finn's own death and their subsequent reunion. The adventure is over. The searching is done. The abandoned child has found, at last, a connection that cannot be taken from him, because there is nothing left to take. The Together Again special deserves extended analysis because it represents the show's most direct statement about what Finn's life meant and what his death accomplished. We see him as an old man, alone in the treehouse, surrounded by evidence of a full life but unmistakably isolated. Jake is gone. The adventures are over. The hero who spent his youth saving the world has become an elderly man waiting for his own end. And when that end comes, his first and only thought is to find his brother. The afterlife Finn navigates is structured like one of his adventures, filled with challenges and obstacles and a goal to pursue. This is psychologically significant. Even in death, Finn cannot simply rest. He must quest, must achieve, must prove himself through action. The pattern established in childhood, the conversion of anxiety into heroism, persists beyond the grave. He is the same person he always was, carrying the same wounds, employing the same coping mechanisms, unable to simply exist without a mission to justify his existence. But something shifts during this final adventure. Finn confronts versions of himself from different points in his life, encounters the accumulated weight of his choices and their consequences, and ultimately accepts something he has been resisting since childhood: the fundamental goodness of his existence independent of what he achieves. The reunion with Jake is not a reward for completing the quest. It is the recognition that the quest was never necessary, that Jake was waiting for him regardless, that love does not require proof of worth, but simply presence. This revelation, coming at the end of Finn's story, reframes everything that came before. His compulsive heroism was never necessary for earning love. His desperate pursuit of validation was always chasing something he already had. The abandoned child, who believed he must prove his worth to deserve connection, discovers, finally, that connection was available all along, waiting for him to stop running long enough to receive it. This is the psychological truth the show has been building toward across its entire run. That the wound of abandonment creates behaviors designed to prevent its recurrence, and that these behaviors often prevent the very connection they are meant to secure. Finn's death is depicted as peaceful because he has finally stopped fighting. Not fighting monsters or villains, but fighting the internal battle that defined his psychology from infancy. He has accepted that Jake loves him not because of what he does, but because of who he is. He has accepted that his worth was never in question, except in his own wounded mind. He has accepted, at last, that the abandoned child he once was has become someone capable of receiving love without having to earn it first. The adventure is truly over, not because the external world has run out of challenges, but because the internal war has finally reached its conclusion. The relationship between Finn and Princess Bubblegum deserves its own extended examination because it represents the template from which all of his subsequent romantic dysfunction would flow. She was his first love, his first experience of wanting someone who could not or would not want him back in the same way. His first confrontation with the devastating reality that feelings do not create obligations, that love does not guarantee reciprocation, that you can want someone with your entire being and still not be entitled to their desire in return. The early seasons present Finn's crush on Bubblegum with the lightness appropriate to a children's cartoon, playing his devotion for gentle comedy allowing his persistent hope to read as endearing rather than troubling. But as the show matured, and as viewers grew alongside it, the dynamics became more complex and more uncomfortable. Finn was not simply a boy with a crush. He was an abandoned child, desperately seeking validation from the most impressive figure in his world, hoping that her love would prove something about his worth that he could not prove to himself. Bubblegum is centuries old, impossibly brilliant, responsible for an entire civilization she literally created from candy and science and willpower. She occupies a position so far above Finn in experience and capability that the fantasy of romantic partnership requires ignoring virtually everything about who she actually is. Finn does not want the real Bubblegum, with her moral complexity and her ruthless pragmatism, and her occasionally terrifying willingness to sacrifice individuals for collective good. He wants an idealized version, a princess who will complete him, a maternal figure who will finally provide the unconditional acceptance his biological mother could not. This dynamic is not unique to Finn. It is the pattern of idealized romantic attachment that psychologists call limerence, the obsessive focus on a love object that has more to do with the lover's unmet needs than with the actual characteristics of the quote, beloved. Finn does not know Bubblegum as a person. He knows her as a symbol, as a projection screen for his fantasies of being loved by someone whose love would validate his existence. When he pursues her with single-minded devotion, he is not pursuing intimacy with another person, but rather seeking external evidence that he matters, that he is worthy, that the abandoned child has become someone deserving of attention from the most important figure in the world he knows. The show handles Bubblegum's response to this pursuit with remarkable sophistication. She cares for Finn genuinely. She values his heroism and his friendship. She does not owe him romance simply because he wants it, and she does not pretend to feel things she does not feel in order to spare his feelings. Her kindness is real but bounded, her affection genuine but not romantic, her willingness to let him down gently a gift that he is not always capable of receiving as such. She models healthy boundary setting, even as Finn models the inability to accept boundaries. The Too Young episode crystallizes this dynamic through a scenario designed to make Finn's fantasy temporarily achievable. Through magical interference, Bubblegum is physically de-aged to 13, temporarily becoming Finn's peer in apparent age, if not in actual experience. For a brief moment, the relationship he has imagined seems possible. They share a kiss. They have fun together. The power differential that made his pursuit inappropriate is apparently removed. And then she must age back up, must return to her responsibilities, must become again the adult ruler whose romantic attention Finn cannot appropriately claim. The psychological cruelty of this episode is precise and deliberate. Finn gets exactly what he wanted, tastes the possibility of his fantasy realized, and then watches it dissolve back into impossibility. The experience teaches him nothing useful because he was not ready to learn. He does not conclude that his pursuit was misguided from the beginning, does not recognize that the brief taste of possibility was an anomaly rather than a promise. He concludes, instead, that he was robbed, that circumstances conspired against him, that the love he deserves was within reach and unfairly taken away. This is the cognitive distortion of the rejected lover, the transformation of personal disappointment into cosmic injustice, the refusal to accept that the object of desire has the right to not desire you back, the gradual erosion of Finn's hope regarding Bubblegum across the middle seasons tracks the painful process of releasing idealized attachment. He does not wake up one day and recognize that his feelings were projections. He does not have a breakthrough conversation that resolves his fixation. He simply accumulates evidence, rejection after rejection, boundary after boundary, until the fantasy becomes too difficult to maintain. This is how most unhealthy attachments end, not through insight, but through exhaustion, not through understanding, but through the gradual depletion of the energy required to sustain delusion. The relationship that develops between Bubblegum and Marceline provides Finn with evidence he cannot ignore about where Bubblegum's romantic interests actually lie. She loves someone, genuinely and deeply, and that someone is not him. This is painful in the obvious way, but it is also painful in a more subtle way. It proves that Bubblegum is capable of romantic love, that her rejection of Finn was not about inability to connect, but about unwillingness to connect with him specifically. He was not denied by circumstances but by choice, not prevented by her nature, but selected against by her preference. This is harder to bear than the fantasy that she simply could not love anyone, that her rejection was impersonal rather than specific. The mature Finn, who appears in later seasons, has largely released his attachment to Bubblegum, has accepted that they will be friends and allies, but not romantic partners, has found the capacity to appreciate her without needing to possess her. This represents genuine growth, the development of what psychologists call post-romantic friendship, the ability to maintain connection after the hope of romance has been abandoned. Not everyone can achieve this. Many people, when romantic hope dies, must sever the connection entirely because the pain of proximity without possibility is too great to bear. Finn's ability to remain close to Bubblegum while accepting her love for someone else demonstrates psychological flexibility that his younger self did not possess. The process by which Finn achieved this acceptance was neither clean nor linear. He did not simply decide to move on and then successfully move on. He struggled, regressed, made choices driven by lingering attachment, behaved in ways that embarrassed him later. The show documents this messiness without judgment, acknowledging that releasing unhealthy attachment is work that takes time and often proceeds through failure rather than around it. Finn had to try and fail, had to feel the pain of hope reviving and dying again, had to accumulate enough disappointment that the fantasy could no longer sustain itself against the weight of reality. This education in romantic disappointment, painful as it was, prepared Finn for healthier relationships later in his life. He learned that love is not entitlement, that desire does not create obligation, that other people are real beings with their own preferences, rather than objects whose function is to satisfy his needs. These are lessons that some people never learn, that some people spend entire lifetimes refusing to acknowledge, because the alternative vision of romance, as cosmic destiny and inevitable reciprocation, is so much more flattering to the ego. Finn learned them young, learned them through suffering, and carried that knowledge into subsequent relationships where it made him, if not a perfect partner, at least a more honest one. The contrast between Finn's relationship with Bubblegum and her relationship with Marceline also taught him something about the nature of compatible love. Bubblegum and Marceline have history, have shared centuries of experience, have navigated conflict and separation and reunion across timescales that Finn cannot comprehend. Their love is between equals in ways that Finn's idealized attachment to Bubblegum never could have been. Watching them together, even through the pain of his own disappointment, Finn could see what genuine romantic partnership looks like, how different it is from the fantasy of being completed by someone more powerful than yourself. The character of Flame Princess represents Finn's second major romantic attachment, and reveals different aspects of his psychological patterns while repeating some of the same fundamental dynamics. Where Bubblegum was unavailable due to age, power, and disinterest, Flame Princess is unavailable due to her literal nature. She is fire. She burns. Physical intimacy with her risks injury or death. Finn, with characteristic obliviousness to his own patterns, pursues her with the same desperate intensity he showed toward Bubblegum, apparently unable to recognize that he has once again chosen someone whose love would be dangerous or impossible to fully receive. The psychological significance of this choice cannot be overstated. Finn has an entire world of potential romantic partners, beings of every conceivable type and nature, many of whom could offer safe and reciprocal connection. He chooses fire. He chooses danger. He chooses someone whose very essence makes the intimacy he claims to want potentially lethal. This is not coincidence but pattern, not bad luck but unconscious selection, the repetition compulsion expressing itself through romantic choice. The abandoned child learns early that love is dangerous, that attachment leads to loss, that the people who should protect you will leave or fail or simply not be there when you need them most. This lesson, absorbed before conscious memory, shapes romantic selection in ways the conscious mind does not recognize. Finn does not think he is choosing unavailable partners because availability feels dangerous. He thinks he is falling in love, responding to genuine attraction, pursuing connection with people who happen to present obstacles, but the obstacles are not incidental, they are the point. They protect him from the intimacy he fears, while allowing him to pursue the intimacy he needs, a compromise formation that keeps him perpetually chasing without ever arriving. Flame Princess is also Finn's first experience of having his romantic feelings reciprocated, which introduces complications he has not previously faced. She likes him back. She wants to be with him. She is willing to work around the practical difficulties of dating someone who might incinerate you. For the first time, Finn's romantic pursuit achieves its stated goal, and he discovers that achieving the goal is not the same as wanting what achievement brings. The relationship with Flame Princess forces Finn to confront his capacity for actual intimacy rather than fantasized intimacy. With Bubblegum, he could imagine what relationship would be like without testing his imagination against reality. With Flame Princess, the relationship is real, with all the mundane difficulties and quotidian disappointments that real relationships entail. She has needs and opinions and moods. She is not a fantasy of completion, but a person with her own psychology, her own wounds, her own expectations that he may or may not be able to meet. The Frost and Fire episode represents Finn's catastrophic failure to handle this reality. He has been having dreams about Flame Princess and Ice King fighting, dreams with obvious sexual energy that his conscious mind cannot integrate. Rather than examining these dreams, rather than bringing his emerging sexuality into conversation with his girlfriend, he acts out. He manipulates the people he loves into literal combat, using deception and betrayal to create the scenario his unconscious desires, causing genuine harm to satisfy needs he cannot acknowledge. This episode is psychologically devastating because it shows Finn at his worst, while making clear that his worst emerges from his wounds rather than his character. He is not evil. He is not cruel by nature. He is a traumatized young man whose psychological development has left him unable to process difficult emotions except through action, unable to integrate sexuality except through displacement, unable to ask for what he needs because he does not know he needs it. He hurts Flame Princess because hurting her is easier than confronting himself, because acting out is the only technique he has learned for managing internal states that overwhelm his capacity to contain them. The consequences of this betrayal are appropriate and painful. Flame Princess ends the relationship. She recognizes that she cannot trust someone who would manipulate her for reasons he cannot explain, who would prioritize his mysterious psychological needs over her well-being, who would treat her as an object in his internal drama rather than a person deserving of honesty and respect. Her departure is not punishment, but self-protection, not abandonment, but boundary. Finn experiences it as confirmation of his worst fears, another loss to add to his collection, more evidence that love leaves and cannot be trusted. But the loss is his fault this time, caused by his choices, a consequence he earned through behavior he could have controlled if he had possessed the psychological tools to control it. The aftermath of Flame Princess's departure shows Finn at his lowest psychological point in the series to this point. He does not understand what he did wrong, cannot articulate why he made the choices he made, feels the loss without being able to learn from it. His friends try to help him process the breakup, but their advice assumes a level of self-awareness he does not possess. They tell him to reflect on his behavior, but reflection requires the capacity to observe oneself with some objectivity, and Finn is too merged with his impulses to separate from them enough to examine them. The Too Old episode shows Finn attempting to return to his pursuit of Bubblegum in the immediate aftermath of losing Flame Princess, regressing to an earlier pattern because the newer pattern has proven painful. This regression is psychologically realistic, the way that loss often sends us back to earlier coping mechanisms rather than forward to new growth. Finn cannot simply learn from one failed relationship and apply those lessons to the next. He must fail again, must discover that regression does not work, must exhaust the old patterns before he can develop new ones. Flame Princess herself demonstrates healthier psychological development than Finn in the aftermath of their relationship. She processes the betrayal, sets appropriate boundaries, and goes on to rule her kingdom with wisdom that suggests she has done the internal work that Finn has avoided. When they interact in later episodes, she is cordial but clear, friendly but not available for the kind of manipulation that characterized their relationship. She models what it looks like to learn from romantic failure rather than simply repeat it, to grow from hurt rather than harden against it. The relationship with Flame Princess also introduces Finn to the experience of being the villain in someone else's story. With Bubblegum, he could maintain the fantasy that circumstances prevented their union, that he was the tragic hero denied his rightful love. With Flame Princess, he must confront the reality that he was the one who destroyed what they had, that his actions caused her pain, that she was right to leave him. This is a crucial developmental experience that many people never have or never accept. The recognition that you are not always the hero, that sometimes you are the source of harm, that your wounds do not excuse the wounds you inflict on others. The guilt Finn carries from this relationship is never fully resolved within the series, surfacing occasionally in ways that suggest ongoing internal conflict. He knows he did wrong. He cannot undo what he did. He must live with the knowledge that he hurt someone who trusted him, that his psychological limitations caused real damage to a real person. This guilt is appropriate but also potentially generative. The recognition of wrongdoing that can motivate genuine change if it is processed rather than buried. Whether Finn ever fully processes it is left ambiguous, another thread in the tapestry of his incomplete psychological development. The concept of the hero's journey provides a framework for understanding Finn's narrative arc that reveals both its adherence to and deviation from traditional mythic structure. Joseph Campbell's famous formulation describes a pattern repeated across cultures and centuries. The hero receives a call to adventure, crosses a threshold into the unknown, faces trials and transformations, and returns home changed, bearing gifts or wisdom for the community. Finn's story follows this pattern in its broad strokes, while complicating it in ways that make his journey feel contemporary rather than classical. The call to adventure is not something Finn receives at a specific moment, but rather the condition of his existence from earliest childhood. He does not choose to become a hero. He was raised as one, trained for it, shaped by a world that needed heroes, and by adoptive parents who recognized his potential. This early assignment of heroic identity creates problems that classical hero narratives do not address. Finn never had to decide whether to accept the call, because the call was never offered as a choice. He was a hero before he was old enough to understand what heroism meant, which means his heroic identity is not an achievement but an inheritance, not chosen but imposed. The psychological implications of unchosen heroism are significant and underexplored in most fictional treatments. When identity is assigned rather than earned, it lacks the stability that comes from personal investment in its construction. Finn is a hero because everyone told him he was a hero, because his world needed him to be a hero, because he never encountered an alternative vision of who he might become. This makes his heroism both more fragile and more compulsive than it would be if he had chosen it after genuine consideration of alternatives. He cannot not be a hero, because being a hero is the only self he knows. But this makes his heroism feel less like virtue and more like compulsion, less like choice and more like fate. The trials Finn faces across the series escalate in ways that track his psychological development and its failures. Early trials are straightforward: monsters to be defeated and princesses to be saved. Challenges that his training prepared him for, and that his youthful confidence allowed him to approach without hesitation. Later trials become more ambiguous, more morally complex, more likely to result in costs regardless of what choice he makes. He faces enemies who are not simply evil but damaged, villains whose motivations he can understand and sometimes sympathize with, situations where heroic action causes harm alongside the good it achieves. These escalating trials expose the limitations of the heroic model Finn was raised with. Simple heroism works when problems are simple, when good and evil are clearly distinguished, when the right action is obvious, and the only question is whether you have courage to take it. Finn has courage in abundance. What he lacks is the moral complexity to navigate situations where courage is not enough, where the right action is unclear, where every choice involves compromise and loss. The hero's journey traditionally prepares its protagonist for this complexity through the trials themselves. But Finn's trials often break him rather than building him, leave him more confused rather than more wise. The transformation that the hero's journey promises is supposed to occur at the narrative's centre, in the belly of the whale or the depths of the underworld, where the old self dies and the new self is born. Finn experiences multiple such moments across the series, but they do not produce the clean transformation the mythic pattern suggests. His arm is torn off and he is broken but not reborn. He meets his mother and is moved but not healed. He confronts his shadow in Fern and achieves partial integration rather than complete wholeness. Each transformative moment changes him, but does not complete him, adds to his experience without resolving his fundamental wounds. This deviation from the classical pattern is not failure, but realism. The hero's journey, as Campbell describes it, is a template for stories, not a description of how actual psychological transformation occurs. Real transformation is messier, more incremental, less dramatic than myth suggests. It happens through accumulated experience rather than singular moments, through the slow work of integration rather than the sudden achievement of enlightenment. Adventure Time honors this reality by showing Finn's transformation as ongoing rather than complete, as process rather than achievement, as something that continues beyond any single narrative climax. The return home that concludes the hero's journey is supposed to find the hero changed in ways that benefit the community, bearing gifts or wisdom that could only have been gained through the trials of adventure. Finn's returns are more ambiguous. He comes back from the islands, knowing things, but not knowing what to do with them. He comes back from battles victorious but damaged. He comes back from relationships ended, having learned lessons he was not yet capable of applying. The gifts he bears are often burdens, the wisdom purchased at prices that seem too high, the transformation partial and provisional rather than complete and permanent. The series finale acknowledges this incompleteness by refusing to provide the closure that traditional hero narratives demand. Finn has not achieved enlightenment. He has not resolved his fundamental wounds. He has not become the perfected hero that the mythic pattern promises. He has simply survived, has grown in ways that fell short of transformation, has become an adult without becoming whole. This is honest in ways that mythology rarely achieves, acknowledging that most journeys do not lead to destinations, that most trials do not produce wisdom, that most heroes remain wounded even after their victories, carrying the costs of their adventures alongside whatever gifts those adventures may have provided. The subversion of the hero's journey in Adventure Time is not nihilistic rejection of heroic possibility, but rather mature acknowledgement of heroic limitation. Finn is genuinely heroic. He has saved countless lives, defeated genuine evil, protected the innocent at great personal cost. These achievements are real and meaningful, but they do not heal him. They do not resolve his psychological wounds. They do not transform him into the completed self that heroic narratives traditionally promise. He can be a hero and still be broken, can save the world and still struggle to save himself, can achieve external success while internal failure persists. This tension between external heroism and internal struggle is perhaps the most psychologically realistic aspect of Finn's character. Many high-achieving people discover that their achievements do not fill the void they expected them to fill, that success in the world does not translate automatically to peace within the self. Finn saves princesses and defeats monsters, and remains the abandoned child, reaching for a father who is already gone. The heroism is real. The wound is also real. They coexist in a person who is neither simply triumphant nor simply broken, but complexly both. The hero's journey framework also highlights what Finn lacks that traditional heroes possess: mentorship from wise elders who can guide transformation. Finn has teachers of various kinds, but none of them can address his fundamental psychological wounds. Joshua and Margaret loved him, but could not give him the secure attachment his infancy denied him. Jake supports him, but cannot understand the specific loneliness of being the last human. Bubblegum advises him, but from a distance that prevents genuine intimacy. He is surrounded by people who care about him, and none of them can reach the places in him that most need reaching. This absence of adequate mentorship reflects a broader truth about psychological healing. It cannot be accomplished for you by others, no matter how wise or loving those others might be. Others can support, can create conditions conducive to healing, can offer resources and perspectives. But the work itself must be done by the wounded person, and Finn has not yet learned how to do that work. He externalizes, acts out, converts internal states to external adventures. The hero's journey, as he lives, it is perpetual motion, constant questing, endless adventure that keeps him too busy to examine what he is running from. The question the series leaves unanswered is whether Finn will ever develop the capacity for internal work that his healing requires. The glimpses of his future suggest he lives a full life, finds love, grows old, dies surrounded by evidence of meaningful existence. But whether he ever heals the core wound, whether he ever stops running long enough to face what the running has been avoiding, whether he ever achieves the psychological transformation that the mythic hero's journey promises, these questions remain open. The show trusts us to understand that such questions rarely have definitive answers, that most lives end with core wounds still partially open, that completion is a fantasy and process is the reality. The relationship between Finn and Jake is the emotional centre of Adventure Time, the constant around which all other variables rotate, the bond that survives every other loss and disappointment that the series inflicts on its protagonist. Understanding this relationship, psychologically, requires understanding what Jake represents for Finn, what needs the Brotherhood fulfills, what limitations it also contains. Jake is brother, best friend, surrogate parent, and adventure companion. He is the one relationship in Finn's life that has never wavered, never betrayed, never fundamentally disappointed. And yet, even this perfect loyalty cannot heal what needs healing in Finn, cannot reach the wounds that predate their meeting, cannot provide what was lost before Finn had the capacity to remember losing it. Jake's psychological function in Finn's life begins with the simple fact of his constancy. In a world where everyone else eventually leaves or disappoints or turns out to be more complicated than initially presented, Jake remains. He is there in the morning and there at night. He shares the treehouse, shares the adventures, shares a life in the quotidian sense that grounds the more dramatic shared experiences. For someone whose earliest experience was abandonment, this constancy is invaluable. It provides the secure base from which Finn can venture into the world, knowing that return is always possible, that someone will be there regardless of how the adventure goes. The psychological literature on attachment describes the secure base as the foundation from which healthy exploration becomes possible. Infants with secure attachment use their caregivers as bases from which to explore the environment, venturing out with confidence because return is assured. Finn's infancy did not provide this secure base, but Jake provides a substitute version that allows Finn to function. He can throw himself into danger because Jake is there. He can pursue relationships because Jake will remain regardless of how they end. He can take the risks that heroism requires because the most fundamental relationship in his life is not at risk. But Jake, as secure base, also has limitations that the show explores, with increasing directness as it matures. Jake has his own life, his own family, his own needs that do not centre Finn. Lady Rainicorn becomes his partner and eventually the mother of his children, creating obligations and attachments that compete with his bond to Finn. The pups themselves demand attention and care. Jake's world expands in ways that necessarily mean less of him is available for the exclusive brotherly bond that Finn's psychology requires. This expansion is healthy and appropriate. It is what should happen as lives develop and relationships multiply. But for Finn, each expansion of Jake's world feels like a small abandonment, a micro-repetition of the original wound. He does not articulate this feeling, may not consciously experience it, but his behavior suggests an underlying anxiety about Jake's availability that intensifies as Jake's other commitments grow. He becomes more reckless, as if testing whether Jake will still save him. He clings more obviously when they are together, as if compensating for time spent apart. He struggles to be happy for Jake's expanding life, even though he genuinely loves Jake and wants him to be happy. The show handles this dynamic with characteristic subtlety, never making Finn villainous in his neediness, but also never pretending his needs are entirely healthy. He is allowed to struggle with Jake's growing independence, allowed to feel the pull of attachment anxiety, allowed to behave in ways that reveal his underlying fears. The show trusts its audience to recognize these behaviors as symptoms rather than character flaws, as evidence of wound rather than evidence of selfishness. Finn wants Jake to be happy. He also wants Jake to be available. These wants conflict, and the conflict causes him pain he cannot fully articulate. Jake's eventual death, which the original series only implies, but which the spin-offs confirm was traumatic and earlier than natural causes would suggest, represents the culmination of every abandonment fear Finn has carried since infancy. The one who stayed has finally left. The secure base has been removed. The constancy that made everything else bearable has proven to be, like all mortal things, temporary. We do not see Finn's immediate response to Jake's death within the original series timeline, but the Together Again special shows us an old Finn whose entire afterlife quest is oriented around reunion with his brother, suggesting that the loss was never integrated, never fully processed, never allowed to heal. The intensity of Finn's need to find Jake in death reflects the intensity of his dependence in life. He cannot rest without Jake. He cannot accept whatever peace the afterlife offers without first restoring the bond that made life bearable. This is touching and also troubling, evidence of love so deep it transcends death, but also evidence of dependence so complete that even death cannot break its hold. Finn's psychology remains organized around Jake, even after both of them have died, suggesting that the attachment, however beautiful, was also a limitation, a constraint on Finn's capacity to develop the internal resources that would allow him to be whole on his own. The question the show raises without answering is whether Finn ever develops a self that does not depend on Jake's presence for stability. The glimpses we see of his life between Jake's death and his own suggest continued functioning, continued heroism, continued engagement with the world. But functioning is not the same as thriving, and the speed with which dead Finn seeks dead Jake suggests that the functioning was maintained through effort rather than genuine psychological health. He survived Jake's absence without becoming someone who could peacefully accept it. He endured the loss without integrating it. He carried on in the way that wounded people carry on, one foot in front of the other, until his own end allowed him to stop carrying. The brother wound, if we can call it that, is different from the parent wound in important ways. Jake did not leave voluntarily. Jake did not abandon Finn through choice, but through the simple fact of mortality. There is no one to be angry at, no betrayal to process, no alternative timeline where Jake could have stayed but chose to go. This makes the loss cleaner in some ways, but also harder in others. Anger can be a vehicle for processing grief, providing energy for the work of integration. When anger is inappropriate, when the loss is no one's fault, the grief has fewer outlets, fewer handles by which to grasp and move it. The Fiona and Cake spin-off reveals that Jake's death was more traumatic than the original series suggested, that it was not peaceful old age, but something more violent, more sudden, more difficult. Finn in that series is dying, poisoned and comatose, trapped in an internal landscape organised around unprocessed grief. The representation of Jake's death trauma as the largest orb in Finn's psychological undergrowth speaks to how central the loss remains to his internal architecture. Even years later, even as an adult, even after continued adventures and relationships, the brother wound has not healed. It has simply been contained, walled off, kept from infecting everything else, but never actually cleaned or closed. The relationship between Finn and Jake also models something important about healthy interdependence that Finn sometimes fails to distinguish from unhealthy dependence. There is nothing wrong with needing people, with deriving stability from relationships, with being sustained by the presence of those we love. The problem arises when this need becomes so total that the self cannot exist independently, when the relationship becomes a substitute for internal development rather than a support for it. Jake was both for Finn, both healthy support and substitute for independent functioning. The good fortune of having Jake allowed Finn to avoid developing capacities he would have been forced to develop if Jake had not been there. This is not Jake's fault. It is simply what happened, the way that being cared for can sometimes prevent us from learning to care for ourselves. The Lich represents something different from Adventure Time's other villains, something that requires psychological rather than merely narrative analysis to understand. He is not a person with comprehensible motivations, not a damaged being whose turn to evil can be traced and potentially reversed, not an antagonist whose defeat represents the triumph of good over evil in any simple sense. He is the embodiment of extinction itself, the will toward absolute ending, the force that exists only to destroy existence. His psychology is not human psychology, and Finn's encounters with him raise questions about what it means to face threats that cannot be reasoned with, cannot be redeemed, cannot be understood through empathic imagination. Finn's battles with the Lich across the series track his developing capacity to confront absolute evil without being destroyed by it. Early encounters show a younger Finn who does not fully comprehend what he is facing, who approaches the Lich with the same heroic confidence he brings to lesser threats, who does not yet understand that some enemies operate on a scale that makes individual heroism almost irrelevant. The Lich does not care about Finn. He does not hate Finn. He simply wants everything to end, and Finn is part of everything, which makes Finn's destruction a subset of his larger goal rather than a personal conflict. This impersonal malevolence is psychologically disorienting in ways the show depicts with precision. Finn is used to being significant, to mattering to the forces he opposes, to occupying a central position in the conflicts he engages. The Lich denies him this significance. Against the Lich, Finn is not a hero but an obstacle, not a protagonist but a variable, not a worthy opponent but a trivial inconvenience on the path to universal extinction. This confrontation with his own insignificance is potentially shattering for someone whose entire psychology is organized around the need to matter, to be valuable, to justify existence through achievement. The ways Finn defeats or contains the Lich across the series are notably indirect, relying on love and connection rather than martial prowess. The Lich is not defeated by Finn's sword, but by Jake's devotion, by the power of the Ice King's lingering humanity, by forces that the Lich's nihilism cannot comprehend or counter. This suggests something important about Finn's psychological development. His growth involves learning that some threats cannot be met with the tools he is trained to use, that heroism sometimes means creating conditions for others to act rather than acting directly, that his individual power is less important than his capacity to foster connections that can accomplish what he cannot accomplish alone. The Lich also forces Finn to confront the possibility of meaninglessness in ways that his usual heroic framework cannot address. If the Lich is right, if existence is a temporary aberration and extinction is the natural state toward which everything tends, then what is the point of heroism at all? Why save anyone when everyone will eventually be lost? Why fight for life when death wins every contest eventually? These are the questions that nihilism poses, and Finn's encounters with the Lich require him to formulate responses, even if those responses are more felt than articulated. Finn's implicit answer to nihilism is not philosophical, but relational. He fights for life because he loves people who are alive. He opposes extinction because his relationships would be extinguished along with everything else. He does not need existence to be cosmically meaningful, as long as it is personally meaningful, as long as Jake and Bubblegum and the others he cares about continue to exist and continue to matter to him. This is not a sophisticated philosophical position, but it is a functional psychological stance, a way of maintaining motivation in the face of the void that the Lich represents. The transformation of the Lich into Sweet Pea, the innocent child form that results from one of their confrontations, represents the show's most hopeful statement about the possibility of redemption, even for absolute evil. The Lich's essence persists within Sweet Pea, occasionally emerging when triggered, but the dominant personality is kind, gentle, loving in ways the Lich could never be. Finn's relationship with Sweet Pea is complicated by the knowledge of what lurks beneath the surface, but his willingness to accept Sweet Pea as a person rather than merely a container for evil represents psychological growth, the capacity to hold complexity rather than demanding simplicity, the ability to love what is genuinely lovable in someone even while remaining aware of what is genuinely dangerous. The Lich forces Finn to develop psychological capacities that ordinary villains would never require. He must learn to face meaninglessness without being paralyzed by it. He must learn to accept his own insignificance within the cosmic scale without losing his sense of significance within the relational scale. He must learn that some threats cannot be defeated through individual effort, and that asking for help is not weakness, but wisdom. These lessons are difficult for someone whose entire identity has been constructed around self-sufficient heroism, and Finn does not learn them perfectly, but the Lich's presence in the series creates opportunities for growth that more comprehensible villains could not provide. The contrast between the Lich and other villains Finn faces illuminates different aspects of his psychology. Ice King triggers Finn's capacity for compassion, revealing the damaged person beneath the villainous behaviour. The vampires of Marceline's past trigger his capacity for moral complexity, for understanding that evil is often circumstantial rather than essential. Orgolorg triggers his capacity to face cosmic horror while maintaining earthly attachments. But the Lich triggers something more fundamental: his capacity to continue in the absence of meaning, to fight when fighting seems pointless, to choose life when death makes a compelling argument. This capacity to choose life, despite its apparent meaninglessness, is sometimes called absurd heroism, after Albert Camus' famous argument that the absurd condition of human existence requires not despair, but rebellion, not suicide, but continued living in defiance of the void. Finn is not a philosopher and would not articulate his stance in these terms. But his behaviour when facing the Lich embodies this absurd heroism, this choice to keep going despite excellent arguments for giving up. He fights extinction not because he believes he will win, but because fighting is what he does, because existence feels worth preserving, even if it cannot be proven to be so. The psychological resources required for absurd heroism are substantial and not easily developed. They require a tolerance for uncertainty that anxious personalities find difficult. They require a commitment to values that does not depend on those values being cosmically validated. They require the capacity to hold hope and hopelessness simultaneously, to act as if outcomes matter while knowing they might not, to care about survival while accepting that survival is temporary. Finn develops these capacities through his encounters with the Lich, but the development is costly, requiring confrontation with truths about existence that many people successfully avoid their entire lives. The Lich also represents the external manifestation of internal annihilating forces that every person carries. The wish to end, to stop, to escape the burden of existence through its termination is a universal human experience that healthy psyches manage rather than eliminate. Finn's battles with the Lich can be read as externalization of this internal struggle, the projection onto a monster of the death wish that he cannot acknowledge within himself. When he defeats the Lich, he defeats his own despair. When he contains the Lich, he contains his own inclination toward giving up. The monster is real, the internal parallel is also real, and facing either prepares him for facing the other. The psychological concept of resilience describes the capacity to maintain functionality in the face of adversity, to recover from setbacks, to sustain a coherent sense of self, even when circumstances conspire to fragment it. Finn's story is fundamentally a story about resilience, about what it takes to keep going when losses accumulate, when wounds compound, when the costs of heroism begin to exceed its rewards. His resilience is genuine and impressive, evidence of psychological strength that survived his early abandonment and continued to develop through subsequent challenges. But his resilience also has costs that the show does not shy away from depicting. Resilience, without processing, is not healing, but deferral. Finn bounces back from losses with remarkable speed, returning to adventure after heartbreak, returning to battle after defeat, returning to hope after disappointment. This capacity serves him well in the short term, allowing continued functionality when others might be incapacitated by grief or discouragement. But the speed of his recovery also prevents the slower, deeper work that genuine integration would require. He does not sit with his losses long enough to understand them. He does not grieve thoroughly before moving on to the next challenge. He uses his resilience as a defense against the pain that healing would require him to feel. This pattern is common among high-functioning, traumatized individuals who often develop remarkable capacities for continuing despite conditions that would break others. The capacity itself is valuable, even necessary for survival in genuinely dangerous environments. But it can become a trap, a way of avoiding rather than processing, a substitute for healing rather than a component of it. Finn's resilience keeps him going. It also keeps him from the stillness that transformation would require. He is too busy being resilient to stop and examine what he is being resilient against. The show depicts the costs of this resilience through accumulating evidence rather than dramatic breakdown. Finn becomes harder across the seasons, less open to vulnerability, more defended against the pain that each new loss threatens to add to his burden. His humour becomes more brittle, his relationships more guarded, his willingness to hope more constrained by experience. He is still recognisably Finn, still heroic and fundamentally good. But he is a Finn whose accumulated experience has changed him in ways that are not entirely positive, whose resilience has been purchased at the price of openness. The concept of post-traumatic growth suggests that adversity can sometimes produce positive psychological development, that people can emerge from suffering not merely resilient, but actually enhanced, with new capacities and perspectives that the suffering made possible. Finn shows evidence of such growth alongside his resilience defenses. He becomes wiser about relationships, more capable of accepting complexity, more willing to acknowledge his own limitations. These are genuine developments, real psychological achievements that his younger self did not possess, but they coexist with the defended hardness, with the deferred grief, with the wounds that have been managed rather than healed. The question of whether Finn ever fully heals is not answered by the series, because such questions rarely have definitive answers in actual lives. He grows, he changes, he develops capacities he did not possess in childhood. He also carries wounds that never fully close, patterns that never fully shift, limitations that persist despite his best efforts. This is realistic in ways that more triumphant narratives about healing are not. Most people who experience early trauma spend their entire lives managing its effects rather than transcending them entirely. They get better. They do not get perfect. They learn to live with what cannot be fixed rather than pretending it has been fixed. Finn's resilience is both his greatest strength and the barrier to his complete healing. It allows him to survive a childhood that might have destroyed a less hardy psyche. It allows him to continue functioning despite losses that would incapacitate others. It also prevents him from ever fully processing what he has experienced, from ever sitting with the pain long enough to integrate it, from ever being still enough to discover who he might be if he stopped running. He is resilient because he had to be. He remains resilient because he does not know how to stop. And this resilience, as valuable as it is also the prison he does not know he is in. The development of resilience in children who experience early adversity follows patterns that psychologists have mapped with increasing precision. Some children shatter, others harden. Still others develop what researchers call flexible resilience, the capacity to bend without breaking, to feel the impact of adversity without being destroyed by it. Finn's resilience is more of the hardening variety than the flexible variety, characterized by suppression rather than integration, by moving forward rather than moving through. This type of resilience has clear survival advantages in dangerous environments. It also creates long-term costs that only become visible when the danger has passed and the suppressed material begins seeking expression. The show tracks these costs through Finn's emotional development across its run. Early Finn cries easily, laughs freely, expresses the full range of emotions with a child's unself-conscious intensity. Later, Finn is more guarded, his emotional expression more controlled, his access to his own feelings more mediated by defensive structures that have developed to protect him from being overwhelmed. This is not simply maturation, but also restriction, not just growing up, but also closing down. The resilience that saved him from being destroyed by his losses has also prevented him from remaining fully open to his own experience. The tension between protection and openness is one of psychology's most fundamental paradoxes. We develop defenses because we need them, because undefended exposure to overwhelming experience would destroy our capacity to function. But the defenses that protect us also constrain us, limiting access to parts of ourselves that were walled off for safety reasons that may no longer apply. Finn built walls in childhood that were absolutely necessary at the time. Those walls remain standing in adulthood, long after the original threats have passed, constraining a self that no longer needs the constraints but does not know how to remove them. The spin-off series and specials suggest that adult Finn has achieved some degree of peace, some capacity for relationship and meaning that his younger self struggled to find. But they also suggest that the fundamental structure of his resilience remains intact, that the walls are still standing, even if they have become more permeable. He loves Huntress Wizard, but cannot fully let her in. He processes Jake's death enough to function, but not enough to truly accept it. He continues adventuring because adventure is the only modality he knows, because stillness remains more frightening than any monster he might face. This picture of incomplete healing is not failure, but realism. Most people who carry early trauma into adulthood find ways to live with it rather than ways to transcend it entirely. They develop relationships, find meaning, experience joy and love and connection. They also carry the original wound, feel its effects in moments of stress or vulnerability, organize aspects of their lives around managing symptoms rather than eliminating causes. Finn's story is this kind of story. The story of someone who survives and even thrives while remaining marked by what he survived, who achieves genuine growth without achieving complete transformation. The psychological resilience Finn displays is ultimately a double-edged gift, providing the strength to endure while creating the conditions that make endurance necessary for longer than it should be. If he could have collapsed, could have fallen apart completely, could have stopped functioning long enough to feel the full weight of his accumulated losses, he might have eventually built himself back with fewer gaps and distortions. But he never fell apart because falling apart was not an option, because Jake needed him and Oo needed him, and his own survival required continued functionality. He paid for this continued functionality with parts of himself that remain inaccessible, walled behind defenses that served their purpose too well to be easily removed. The final assessment of Finn's psychological journey must hold this complexity without resolving it into simple triumph or simple tragedy. He is genuinely resilient, genuinely strong, genuinely capable of connection and heroism and growth. He is also genuinely damaged, genuinely defended, genuinely limited by patterns established before he had the choice or capacity to establish different ones. He is, in short, a realistic depiction of what trauma survival actually looks like. Not complete recovery, but functional accommodation. Not transcendence, but integration of the wound into a self that continues despite it. The alternate versions of Finn that appear throughout Adventure Time provide psychological insight through contrast, showing who he might have become under different circumstances and illuminating the contingency of personality development. Farmworld Finn, the version who exists in a timeline where the Mushroom War never happened, demonstrates how profoundly environment shapes identity. This Finn is still recognizably Finn in some essential way, still brave and loyal and fundamentally good, but his circumstances have produced a different person with different wounds and different capacities. He loses the same arm to different causes, suggesting that some losses are somehow essential to who Finn is across timelines. that the reaching and the cost of reaching are woven into his being, regardless of context. The existence of multiple Finns raises questions about the relationship between identity and circumstance that the show does not resolve but invites us to consider. How much of who Finn is results from his particular history, and how much would persist across any possible version of his life? The abandonment wound seems specific to our Finn, the product of his particular origin story. But the heroic impulse, the willingness to sacrifice, the fundamental orientation toward protecting others appears across versions, suggesting something more essential. Perhaps Finn is, at his core, someone who reaches toward connection at personal cost, and this reaching expresses itself differently in different contexts, but remains constant in its basic structure. The psychological concept of personality attempts to name what remains stable across situations, and, over time, the characteristic patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving that make a person recognizably themselves. Finn's personality, viewed across his alternate versions, seems to include this reaching quality, this heroic orientation, this willingness to absorb damage in service of protecting others. These traits persist even when his circumstances change dramatically, suggesting they represent something fundamental about who he is rather than merely the products of his particular upbringing. But the wounds differ, and the wounds shape how the fundamental traits express themselves. Our Finn's reaching is coloured by abandonment, by the desperate need to prove worth through saving others, by the conversion of attachment anxiety into compulsive heroism. Farmworld Finn's reaching might have different motivations, might be less driven by psychological need and more by simple virtue. We cannot know for certain because the show does not explore his interiority with the same depth. But the contrast suggests that Finn's heroism, while genuine, is also entangled with his pathology in ways that a less wounded version might not share. The Fern arc provides the most extended exploration of Finn's alternate self, creating a version of him that embodies the aspects he has rejected and denied. Fern is Finn's aggression, his selfishness, his desire to be the only one, the special one, the irreplaceable one. He wants Finn's life not because that life is objectively superior, but because wanting is what he is, because the desire to possess and claim and own was the part of Finn that went into making him. The conflict between Finn and Fern is the conflict between a person and their shadow, between the self they present and the self they suppress. Jungian psychology describes the shadow as containing not only negative qualities, but also positive ones that have been disowned, energies and capacities that the conscious personality could not integrate, and therefore pushed into the unconscious. Fern embodies Finn's competitive drive, his will to power, his refusal to accept limitation. These qualities are not simply evil, though they express themselves destructively in Fern's case. They are the forceful aspects of Finn's nature that his heroic self-concept could not accommodate, the parts of him that wanted things for himself rather than for others. The integration of Fern at the series' end represents a partial healing of this split, an acknowledgement that the shadow is part of the self rather than an enemy to be destroyed. Finn cannot eliminate Fern without eliminating part of himself. He can only learn to hold the complexity, to accept that he contains both the hero and the shadow, both the selfless protector and the selfish claimant. This acceptance is not completion, but it is progress, the kind of psychological growth that makes life more livable even if it does not resolve all tensions. The alternate Finns collectively suggest that identity is both stable and contingent, both essential and constructed. there is something that makes Finn Finn across all versions, some quality or pattern that persists regardless of circumstance. There is also something profoundly shaped by circumstance, by the particular wounds and relationships and experiences that each version accumulates. Our Finn is the product of abandonment, metabolized through heroism, of trauma transformed into protective action, of love sought through saving. Another Finn might have been different, but this Finn, the one we followed for 10 seasons, is who he became because of what he experienced. His wounds are not incidental to his heroism. They are, in some complicated way, its source. The multiplicity of Finns also raises questions about responsibility and moral evaluation that psychology cannot fully answer. If Finn's heroism emerges from his wounds, is it less praiseworthy than it would be if it emerged from pure virtue? If his reaching toward others is driven by desperate need rather than simple generosity, does that diminish its value? The show seems to suggest that the origin of virtue does not determine its worth, that help helps regardless of why the helper helps, that Finn's heroism is real and valuable, even if its psychological roots are tangled and complicated. This is a generous view of human motivation, one that acknowledges that most virtue is impure, that most good deeds have mixed motivations, that waiting for purely selfless action would mean waiting forever. The farm world version of Finn provides particularly rich material for psychological comparison. This Finn grew up in a world without magic, without the mutations and transformations that made Ooh what it is, presumably with a human community that our Finn never knew. His life appears simpler on the surface, a farm boy rather than a hero, a family member rather than an orphan. But even this apparently healthier upbringing does not protect him from tragedy. His devotion to his family makes him vulnerable to exploitation by forces he does not understand. His love for his younger brother becomes a lever that villains use to manipulate him. The lesson seems to be that Finn cannot escape his fundamental nature, which is to love intensely enough to be hurt intensely, to care deeply enough to be deeply wounded. The philosophical question of personal identity across possible worlds has occupied thinkers for centuries, asking what makes a person the same person across different circumstances and over time. The show's treatment of alternate Finns suggests a particular answer. Identity consists not of specific experiences or memories, but of patterns, tendencies, characteristic ways of engaging with whatever circumstances arise. All Finns are heroic. All Finns reach toward connection. All Finns lose something in the reaching. The specific content differs, but the structure persists, suggesting that Finn is defined by his form rather than his content, by how he engages rather than what he engages with. This structural view of identity has implications for how we understand Finn's psychology more broadly. His wounds are specific to his timeline, the products of particular events that could have been otherwise. But his way of responding to wounds, his conversion of pain into protection, his transformation of loss into motivation for preventing others' losses, this seems more fundamental, more essential to who he is across all possible versions. The wound could have been different. The response to wounding appears to be constant. The meeting of Finn and his alternate selves in various episodes creates opportunities for self-recognition that most people never receive. He can see, quite literally, who he might have been under different conditions. This is potentially valuable for psychological development, offering perspective on the contingency of identity that most people only access through imagination. But Finn never seems to use these encounters for deep self-reflection. He is too busy surviving them, too caught up in the immediate crises they present to pause and consider what they reveal about the nature of his own existence. This is characteristic of his psychology more broadly, the preference for action over reflection, for doing over understanding, for meeting challenges rather than examining their meaning. The concept of identity formation describes the process by which a person develops a coherent sense of who they are, what they value, where they belong in the social world. This process is lifelong but has critical periods, particularly in adolescence and early adulthood, when the foundations of adult identity are typically established. Finn's identity formation is complicated by his unique position as the last human, by his early abandonment, by the absence of models for what a human life should look like. He must invent his identity rather than inheriting it, must create meaning rather than receiving it, must become someone without templates for who that someone might be. The absence of human community is a more profound loss than the show sometimes explicitly acknowledges. Finn has no human elders to teach him about human development, no peers to compare himself to, no tradition to situate himself within. He must figure out what being human means entirely through improvisation, taking cues from the non-human beings who surround him, without any guarantee that their guidance applies to his particular nature. This is an extraordinary challenge for identity formation, the requirement to create a self without access to the cultural resources that typically support such creation. The psychological literature on identity formation emphasizes the importance of what Erik Erikson called psychosocial moratorium, a period of exploration in which the developing person can try on different possible identities before committing to one. Finn's moratorium is extended across the entire series, a prolonged period of exploration in which he tries being a hero, a boyfriend, a brother, a son, a friend, without ever fully consolidating these roles into a stable adult identity. The exploration is valuable, but also exhausting, the constant invention demanding resources that a more supported identity formation might conserve. Finn's identity as hero is the closest thing he has to a stable core, but even this identity is more complicated than it appears. He did not choose heroism after considering alternatives. He was raised to it, shaped for it, defined by it, before he had the developmental capacity to evaluate whether it was what he actually wanted. This makes his heroic identity both central and fragile, the foundation of his self-concept, and also a potential prison if circumstances ever make heroism impossible. What would Finn be if he could not be a hero? The show gestures toward this question without fully answering it, suggesting that the question itself causes him anxiety that he prefers to avoid through continued heroic action. The Islands miniseries provides the most direct confrontation with identity questions, forcing Finn to ask who he would be among other humans, whether his heroic identity would survive contact with a community that might offer alternatives. His choice to return to U, rather than staying with his people, is partly a choice about identity, a decision that who he has become matters more than who he might have been. He is Finn the hero, raised by dogs in a post-apocalyptic wonderland, and he will not abandon that identity, even for the belonging that his childhood wound has always craved. This choice represents a kind of identity achievement, the commitment to a chosen self that identity development aims toward. But it is also a foreclosure, a closing off of possibilities that remaining open might have allowed. Finn does not seriously consider becoming something other than a hero, because heroism is all he knows, because imagining alternatives would require psychological resources he has invested elsewhere. His identity is achieved in the sense that he has committed to it, but the achievement came before genuine exploration, making it more like acceptance of the inevitable than choice among genuine alternatives. The tension between identity achievement and identity foreclosure runs through Finn's entire story. He has become someone, has developed a coherent sense of self, can answer the question, "Who am I?" with confidence and consistency. But the identity he has achieved was largely given to him rather than genuinely chosen, constructed from the materials his circumstances provided, rather than selected from a range of genuine options. This is not unusual. Most people's identities are shaped more by circumstance than by choice, constrained more by necessity than by possibility. But Finn's particular constraints, his abandonment and his uniqueness and his early assignment to heroic duty, are unusually limiting, leaving him with an identity that fits like armor rather than like skin. The question of who Finn might have been haunts the series without ever being fully addressed. If he had not been abandoned, if he had grown up among humans, if he had been allowed to explore identity before committing to one, what might have emerged? We cannot know, and perhaps the impossibility of knowing is part of the show's psychological honesty. We are all the products of circumstances we did not choose, shaped by events that occurred before we could consent or resist. The self we become is always partly arbitrary, the result of contingencies that could have been otherwise. Finn's identity, like all identities, is both the achievement of his development and the limitation it imposes. The role of heroism in Finn's identity development deserves particular attention because it is the aspect of his identity that seems most achieved and also most potentially constraining. Being a hero gives Finn purpose, direction, a clear sense of what he should be doing at any given moment. It provides him with social validation, community respect, a role that earns him the positive regard his psychology craves. It structures his time and his relationships, organizing his life around a coherent narrative that makes sense of his experiences. In these ways, heroic identity serves him well, providing psychological benefits that less clearly defined identities might not offer. But heroic identity also constrains in ways that become more visible as the series progresses. What happens when there are no monsters to fight, no princesses to save, no adventures to undertake? Finn does not know how to be when he is not doing, does not have a sense of self that can survive the absence of heroic activity. His identity depends on performance, on continued demonstration of heroic capacity, on external challenges that call forth his heroic response. Without these challenges, he would have to confront a self that might feel empty, that might not know who it is when not being heroic, that might discover it was never really a self at all, but merely a role being played with increasing desperation. The psychological concept of role engulfment describes what happens when a person becomes so identified with a single role that other aspects of selfhood atrophy. Finn shows signs of role engulfment throughout the series, his identity as hero crowding out other possible identities, his sense of self dependent on heroic performance to a degree that makes non-heroic existence nearly unthinkable. This is not simply devotion to heroism, but over-identification with it. Not just valuing the role, but being unable to imagine oneself outside of it. The Islands miniseries confronts Finn with a vision of life beyond heroism, showing him a community where his particular skills are less needed, where other paths to meaning are available. His inability to seriously consider staying reflects not just his attachment to Jake and Ooh, but also his fear of discovering who he might be in a context that does not require him to be a hero. The choice to return is framed as positive, a commitment to chosen identity over given identity. But it is also a retreat from the threatening possibility of identity transformation, a preference for the known self over the unknown self that might emerge from genuinely different circumstances. The development of identity beyond heroism is something Finn must eventually achieve if he is to mature psychologically, if he is to become someone capable of resting, of peace, of existence that does not depend on achievement for its justification. The glimpses of his future suggest he may eventually achieve this, may find ways of being that do not require constant doing. But within the main series, this achievement remains aspirational rather than actual, something hinted at rather than depicted. The work of becoming more than a hero is left for the off-screen years, the decades of life we do not witness but must imagine. The psychological journey of Finn the Human across Adventure Time and its spin-offs describes an arc that resists simple characterization as either triumph or tragedy. He begins as a child, carrying wounds he does not understand, coping with abandonment through compulsive heroism, seeking, in the validation of others, the sense of worth that his earliest experiences denied him. He ends as an adult who has loved and lost, who has saved worlds and broken hearts, who has achieved genuine growth without achieving complete healing, who remains recognizably himself while having become someone his childhood self could not have imagined. The refusal to provide complete healing is perhaps the show's most psychologically honest choice. Real trauma does not resolve cleanly. Real wounds leave scars that affect function even after the acute injury has closed. Real people carry their early experiences throughout their lives, managing the effects rather than eliminating the causes, building lives around limitations rather than transcending them entirely. Finn's story honours this reality by showing growth that is genuine but incomplete, change that is real but partial, healing that helps without curing. The relationships Finn builds across the series provide the context within which his growth occurs, even if they cannot provide the healing that his deepest wounds require. Jake offers stability and companionship that partially compensate for the secure attachment Finn's infancy lacked. Bubblegum teaches him about the limits of romantic pursuit and the possibility of post-romantic friendship. Flame Princess teaches him about the consequences of acting out and the pain of being the one who did wrong. Huntress Wizard offers the possibility of intimacy between equals, earned through the slow work of building trust between damaged people. Each relationship contributes something to his development, even the ones that end in pain. The heroism that defines Finn's life is revealed across the series to be both genuine virtue and psychological symptom, both admirable choice and compulsive necessity. He saves people because saving people is good. He also saves people because saving people is the only way he knows to manage the anxiety that not saving would produce. These motivations are not mutually exclusive. Most real virtue is similarly mixed, driven by both genuine goodness and personal need, expressing both care for others and care for self. The purity we imagine in true heroes is largely fiction, a simplification that actual psychology does not support. The losses Finn accumulates, the arm and the father and the relationships, and eventually Jake himself, do not break him but do mark him. He carries them forward, incorporates them into his sense of who he is, builds an identity that includes the scars rather than hiding them. This is what psychological survival looks like for most people who experience significant trauma. not the transcendence of suffering, but its integration, not the elimination of wounds, but their incorporation into a self that continues despite them. The show's final statements about Finn, scattered across the finale and the spin-offs, suggest a life that continued to be worth living, a person who continued to love and be loved, a hero who continued to save others even as he struggled to save himself. The old Finn, glimpsed in future visions, is not a triumphant figure, but a peaceful one. Someone who has found some accommodation with his demons, even if he has not entirely defeated them. This peace is not nothing. It may be the most that can realistically be hoped for. What Finn's story ultimately offers is not a prescription for healing, but a description of survival. It shows what it looks like to carry early wounds into adulthood, to cope through action and relationship and purpose, to build a life that is meaningful even if it is not unmarked. It shows the costs of such survival, the defences that protect and also constrain, the resilience that saves and also imprisons. And it shows that such survival can be enough, that a life built around wounds can still be a life worth living, that the abandoned child can become someone worthy of love even if he never entirely believes it. For those who watch Adventure Time, recognizing something of themselves in Finn's story, this depiction may be more valuable than any fictional cure could be. It validates the experience of surviving without transcending, of coping without healing, of carrying forward what cannot be put down. It suggests that such lives are worthy of epic treatment, that heroes can be damaged without being diminished, that the struggle itself is meaningful even when it does not end in victory. And perhaps, in the end, this is what Finn's psychology teaches most clearly, that being human is struggle, that struggle is not failure, and that continuing the struggle, day after day, and adventure after adventure, is its own form of heroism that requires no external validation to be real. The complete psychology of Finn the human cannot be reduced to a single diagnosis or a simple developmental narrative. He is not merely an abandoned child, or merely a compulsive hero, or merely a traumatized adolescent struggling toward adulthood. He is all of these things and more, a complex person whose psychology has been shaped by forces he did not choose and whom he has shaped in turn through choices he did make. The interplay between circumstance and choice, between wound and response, between limitation and transcendence, is the substance of his psychological journey. What the show offers through Finn's story is not a case study, but a portrait, not a diagnosis, but an invitation to understanding. We are asked to see Finn not as a collection of symptoms, but as a person, not as a psychological type, but as an individual whose particular configuration of wounds and strengths makes him uniquely himself. This invitation extends to ourselves as well, to the recognition that our own psychologies are similarly complex, similarly shaped by forces beyond our control and choices within our power, similarly resistant to simple characterization. The value of understanding Finn psychologically lies not in explanation, but in recognition. When we see his compulsive heroism as a response to abandonment, we do not thereby reduce it to pathology, but rather understand why it feels necessary, why it persists despite its costs, why he cannot simply decide to be different. When we see his relationship patterns as repetitions of early trauma, we do not condemn him, but rather understand the difficulty of breaking patterns established before conscious memory began. Understanding creates compassion, and compassion creates the possibility of acceptance that mere analysis cannot provide. Finn's journey from wounded child to wounded adult, from desperate hero to something like peace mirrors journeys that many viewers have taken or will take in their own lives. The specifics differ, but the pattern resonates. The early experiences that shape us before we can shape back, the coping mechanisms that help and also hurt, the slow, difficult work of building something livable from materials we did not choose. His story tells us that this journey is possible, that survival is achievable, that lives built around wounds can still be lives worth living. The final image of Finn at peace with Jake in whatever realm follows death is not an ending but a promise. A suggestion that the struggle does eventually find rest, that the reaching does eventually find connection that cannot be taken away. It is, perhaps, a fantasy, a wishful vision of closure that actual lives rarely achieve. But it is also hope, and hope is something that wounded people need as much as analysis, as much as understanding, as much as the honest acknowledgement that some wounds never fully heal. Adventure Time gave us 10 seasons to watch Finn struggle, and in watching his struggle, we were given permission to acknowledge our own. That permission, that validation of survival as an achievement worthy of epic treatment, may be the greatest gift the show offers to those who see themselves in its unlikely hero. Finn the human, last of his kind, abandoned before he could remember being held, reached toward connection his entire life and lost pieces of himself in the reaching. He is not whole. He is not healed. He is alive and loved and still reaching. And that, the show tells us, is enough. That is what being human means. That is what all of us, in our various ways, are doing every day we choose to continue. We reach and we lose and we reach again. And we call this reaching life. And it is, somehow, worth the cost.